My Bible is open to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. And while you're turning to Mark 6, I want to ask you a fairly simple question. Who is Jesus? Now, while you're thinking about that question, I want to give some context. Imagine for a second you're on vacation. You're in Houston, you're in Dallas, you're in San Antonio, you're somewhere on vacation, and a guy with a camera comes up to you and says, I got a couple questions to ask you. And you're sitting there thinking, okay, this is going to be about current events, and this is going to be about politics, this is going to be about the election, this is going to be about something, and so your mind starts to go to those places, and then they turn on the camera, stick the mic in your face, and go, who is Jesus? Now, for some of us, I think that may frighten a little bit of us, and I get it. The idea of having to answer that question with a camera and a mic kind of is a little bit intimidating. I get that. I understand that. Several years ago, I went to Chicago with my father-in-law, and while we're in Chicago for the NFL draft, and for those of you who aren't sports fans, that's okay, but the NFL draft is that time of the year when college players are selected by the professional teams. And so my father-in-law and I went up to Chicago for the NFL draft. And while we're there, some guy with a camera goes, hey, I wonder if there are any Titans fans around here. Well, you guys know I'm a Titans fan. And I'm, Titans apparel head to toe. And I raise my hand. I'm like, I'm a Titans fan. He's like, I want to interview you after the Titans pick. I'm like, okay, that's okay. So I spent the next 30 minutes and waiting for the time for the Titans to pick and trying to formulate my answer because I kind of knew where the question was going to be. And I was nervous because I didn't want to be that crazy Tennessean you always see in the news when there's a tornado. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about, just look crazy Tennesseans and tornadoes on YouTube and you'll understand. I wanted to be somewhat coherent. I didn't want to look like a rambling crazy man. So I understand being a little nervous with a camera and a microphone stuck in our face with a very simple question. But still, if you were asked that question, who is Jesus? How would you respond? What would you say? I think that's what we see there in Mark chapter 6 will be our main text today. We've been working our way through Mark's gospel, and really here in Mark chapter 6, it's several different stories of people trying to wrestle with that very simple question. Who is Jesus? Really, the first 8 chapters of Mark's gospel have to do with people trying to answer that question. There in Mark chapter 6, in the first couple of verses of that chapter, Jesus is back home in his hometown in Nazareth, and you would expect everyone back home would know who Jesus is. They would know what he means. They would know everything about him, except there in Mark chapter 6, as he's teaching, they're kind of shocked. They're astonished. They're looking at Jesus there in verse 2, and they're going, where did this man get these things? What is this wisdom that has been given to him, and how are these miracles performed by his hands? Isn't this the son of the carpenter? Isn't this the son of Mary? Don't we know his siblings? Didn't he grow up around the corner? Didn't we see him playing as a kid? They're looking at Jesus and they're struggling to answer that question. And so Jesus says there in verse 4, a prophet is without honor in his hometown. Short time later, there in Mark chapter 6, Herod, which was the governor or the king of the region, the ruler of the region, is starting to hear about Jesus, and he starts to wonder, who is this Jesus? And they start throwing out ideas, and he goes, I think Jesus is this John the Baptist figure that's been raised from the dead. I beheaded him, but somehow his head got put back on, and he's raised from the dead, and he's going around teaching again. But there in the Gospel of Mark, here in Mark chapter 6, his own disciples are struggling. Jesus' own disciples, his inner circle, his best friends, if I can put it that way, are struggling to answer the question, who is Jesus? That even though Jesus has commissioned them there in verses 7 through 13 to go out and to preach and to work miracles, and they've gone out and they've preached and they've worked miracles, they still struggle to answer the question, Who is Jesus? Sometimes they get the question right, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they get it, and sometimes they don't. And aren't we the same way in our life? When we think about that question, who is Jesus? Isn't there times in our life where we get it? We're like, yes, I know who Jesus is. He's the Son of God. He's my Savior. He's my Master. He's my King. He's my Lord. And we get it. We know that because Jesus is Lord, this is what it means for my life. Because Jesus is Savior, this is what it means for my life. And we understand everything about it. But sometimes in our life, when we're asked that question, when we're faced with that question, we're kind of like the disciples here in Mark 6. We struggle to answer the question, who is Jesus? And we're trying to make sense of what it means for him in our life. So who is Jesus to us? That's a question that we all must answer. Everyone who has lived or will ever live must come face to face with this very simple question that's there on the screen and that the disciples are faced with here in the text. Who is Jesus? And there's a lot here in Mark chapter 6 that I think will help us answer the question. Who is Jesus? And so today what I want to do is look at the one simple truth I see here in the text, and then look at two implications or two words of comfort for us as we wrestle with that very simple question, who is Jesus? When we get to the main part of our text today, and the main focus, which is going to begin there in verse 45, the disciples have just returned from that short mission trip that we just talked about. They've worked miracles. They've driven demons out. They're healing the sick. And now they're in the middle part of Mark chapter 6. Jesus is preaching to the crowd, but it gets a little late there in the text, and the disciples are starting to get worried. And there in verse 35, they approach Jesus and tell Jesus, this place is deserted and it's already late. Send them away so that they can go into the surrounding countryside and villages and to buy them something to eat. You know, that's a good thing to say. If you look around and it's starting to get about 5 or 6 or 7 o'clock at night and you don't have food for people to eat, you're probably sitting here going, we probably should let them go. Let them hit Wendy's. Let them hit Chick-fil-A. Let them go out and run by the grocery store and get something on their way home. It's time for them to eat. But what's interesting is that's not what Jesus says there in the text. He looks at them there in verse 37 and says, you give them something to eat. That's a little bit of a challenging statement. There's 5,000 men there in the crowd. That's a lot of people. And Jesus looks at the disciples and says, you've worked miracles. You should know who I am. You should know what I'm capable of. You give them something to eat. And yet the disciples there in the second half of verse 37 say, should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? The way we may put it today is, should we go max out our credit cards to buy food for this crowd? Should we run down to Brookshire Brothers and wipe out Brookshire Brothers of anything there in the grocery store so we can make sure we can feed the crowd? And then Jesus asks there in the text, what do you have? What do we have present with you? And there's 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And from 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, Jesus goes on and feeds 5,000 men. You see, even though the disciples have witnessed Jesus' miracles, they have witnessed this miracle here in this text, and they've heard him preach, they don't seem to get that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the one that they've been waiting for. And there it leads him to do something there in verse 45 that may puzzle us initially. Let's go in and read verse 45 there in the text. We'll read 45 through 52 together, where it says, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he said goodbye to them, he went away into the mountain to pray. Well into the night, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. He saw them straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Very early in the morning, he came to them walking on the sea, and he wanted to pass by them. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. And immediately that's Jesus, spoke with them and said, "Have courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. They were completely astounded because they had not understood about the loaves. Instead, that's Jesus' own disciples, their heart was hardened. What's interesting to me is after working this miracle, the first thing Jesus does, the text tells us there, is that he tells his disciples to get into a boat and to go somewhere else. Jesus makes his disciples go somewhere. And that's really where we see the ultimate truth here in the text, and that's Jesus is Lord. That Jesus, yes, is working these miracles, and he's preaching, he's doing all these marvelous deeds. But Jesus is also telling his disciples what to do, and he does that because he's Lord. But what's also interesting is I think Jesus knows what's ahead for his disciples. He knows what lies ahead that night as they cross the sea. But he sends them away anyway. Why in the world would Jesus, the Son of God, Lord of creation, send his own disciples into a storm? Well, the text doesn't tell us specifically. But if we were to zoom out and to look at all of Mark's gospel, one of the things I think we would see is that Jesus is working his powers, and he's doing these miracles, and he's preaching these sermons, and he's doing all of these things so people would understand who he is. So they would understand that Jesus is Lord. And I think that's why Jesus sends them ahead into the storm. He wants his disciples to be able to answer that question. Who is Jesus? He wants to build their faith. He wants them to realize that Jesus is Lord, that he is the one that they should trust in. And to their credit, there in the text, the disciples get in the boat. They obey their Lord, their master, and they set up across the sea. No big deal, right? Well, right in the middle of the sea, they run into a pretty strong storm. And the text there in verse 48 tells us that they were straining at the oars because the wind was against them. The waves are raging, the wind is roaring, they are stuck in the middle of the sea. But that's exactly where Jesus wants them. He wants his disciples to believe he is Lord. He wants them to believe that he is the Messiah. And he wants the disciples to trust them, even if it means going through a storm. Jesus has his disciples right where he wants them, right here in the middle of the storm. And so much for the idea that we may have even today, that following Christ means never having any trouble in our life. Sometimes following Jesus, sometimes obeying God, which is exactly what the disciples are doing here in the text that got them in this situation. Sometimes obeying God will lead us into a storm. That life won't always be comfortable. But it's when we're in the middle of that storm that we learn to trust Jesus and we remember that Jesus is Lord, and we can get through the storm, which is what we're going to see happen to the disciples. I guess I should leave a disclaimer there to say spoiler alert, but they do make it through the storm. That as much as we may want today to have that blessed life, that successful life, that comfortable life, we may need to endure storms to build our faith. And that's exactly what's happening, I think, with the disciples here in Mark 6. That they're not quite getting that Jesus is Lord. They're not quite getting that Jesus is Messiah. They're not quite getting what that means for their life. And so Jesus says, get in the boat. Go ahead of me, knowing full and well that's going to lead them into a storm. But he does that to build their faith, to help them realize that he is Lord. And he shows his Lord in two basic ways in the rest of the chapter. The first one is found as the story continues there in verse 48, because I think it's something that is extremely comforting, at least for me. That even as they are in the middle of this fierce storm, even as the waves are crashing over them, even as they can't go anywhere because the wind is against them, look there in verse 48 one more time. He saw. Jesus saw the disciples. Who is Jesus? Yes, he is Lord, but he is also a Lord who sees. Jesus sees them. He sees his disciples in the storm. He sees them straining in the storm, and he goes to them as the story unfolds. Remember, when the disciples are in the middle of the sea, when they're facing this storm that they're straining as the winds are fierce, where is Jesus? Well, if we go back to verse 46 and to verse 47, it tells us that he went on a mountain to pray. He's on land, they're in the sea. He's comfortable on land, and yet they're in the storm. But even though they are apart, because Jesus is Lord, they're never out of his sight. Because no storm can stop Jesus from seeing his disciple. But there in the text, he does more than just see them and watch them from a distance. He goes to them. Very early in the morning, he starts walking on water, walking on the sea. And it says there in the text, he wanted to pass by them. Now, I think we read over this because I think for some of us, this is maybe a familiar story. We've heard in Sunday school Jesus walking on the water. We know that story maybe. But we see that last phrase, he wanted to pass by them, and we kind of read over that. But I think this is a powerful, powerful text because it connects our minds, or should connect our minds, back to some passages back in the Old Testament, back to Moses on Mount Sinai there in Exodus 34. When Moses is on Mount Sinai, he's going through a storm in his life and in his ministry. You see, there in Exodus 34, Moses has gone up the mountain, he's gotten the 10 Commandments, and he's come back down, and he sees Israel in the golden calf. Israel has already sinned against God. When he's up on the mountain getting the law, they're sinning against God, and he drops the 10 Commandments. And he has to go back up the mountain there in Exodus 32, 33, and 34 to get the new 10 Commandments. And while he's up on the mountain, he talks to God. And the glory of God passes by Moses there on Mount Sinai during a difficult time in his ministry. A couple hundred years later, Elijah's a prophet of God, and he's having a difficult time in his ministry. He's a little frustrated. He's a little depressed. He's a little down, so he takes off to Mount Sinai. And while he's there on Mount Sinai, once again, the glory of God passes by Elijah to comfort Elijah during the storm in his life. Now look at the picture that Mark is painting for us there in Mark chapter 6, that the disciples, God's people, are in the middle of a storm, and there it is that Jesus is walking on the sea and wants to pass by them. That just as God had passed by Moses on the mountain, that just as the Lord passed by Elijah there on Mount Sinai, once again, the Lord is passing by his people during a storm. And that should have comforted the disciples, because God, in the human flesh, Jesus himself, is walking to his disciples in the middle of the storm. God is revealing his grace and his mercy and his love and his power to his disciples as Jesus walks to them on the water. He's reminding them that the Lord sees them in distress, and this should have comforted them. But instead, there in the text, we see they are terrified. Verse 50. They think they see a ghost. So they cry out. And honestly, can you blame them? I mean, if we're out on Lake Sam Rayburn and we're in there in the middle of the night fishing, and we start to see someone walking on water, wouldn't we be a little terrified? I think most of us would be a little terrified if I saw somebody walking on water in the middle of the night on Lake Sam Rayburn. But then Jesus speaks there in verse 50. He says, "Have courage, it is I." Or more literally translated, I am. Don't be afraid. Who is Jesus? Jesus is Lord. But he's the Lord who sees you in the middle of the storm. That's why they don't have to be afraid. That's why they can have courage, because the Lord is with them. That even in the middle of the storm, Jesus is trying to comfort his disciples. That sometimes in the middle of our storms, of our life, what we need is not more courage. What we need is not more strength. What we need is to look to God, to look to the Lord and remember that Jesus sees. Guys, we need to take comfort in that. That even when the storms are rough, even when life is difficult, Jesus sees. And we need to have faith in our Lord. That even in those storms, Jesus is always and will always be Lord. That's what I think Jesus is trying to teach his disciples here in the storm. But instead of passing by his disciples there, it tells us that he got in the boat with them and the storm stops. That's power. But think about that for a second. The God of the universe, the Lord of all creation, got in the boat with unbelieving sinners like his disciples. You know, when Jesus walks on the water to get to his disciples, he is showing that he is God who rules over all creation, who has power over all creation, and he's seeing them in their distress. But when he gets in the boat with his disciples, he's showing his disciples that he is God and he wants to be with his people in the storm, that he's not a distant and far off God. He's a God, he is a Lord who wants to be close to his people. I think there's a lesson for us to remember here. That we can never let the presence of a storm in our life doubt the presence of God in our life. That even when we are going through the storms that we may face in our life, God still sees and God still wants to be with his people. And yet as the story unfolds into verse 52, the disciples still don't get it. They're a little astounded because they don't understand what Jesus is trying to teach them. They look back and they don't understand what Jesus is trying to teach them there with the feeding of the 5,000, and they don't seem to understand what Jesus is trying to teach them here by walking on water to them. Jesus wants them to understand that he sees them in their distress and he wants to provide for his people. But he wants them to understand they need to have faith and they need to trust him completely. You know, Jesus still sees us today. Jesus knows the storms that we're going through. And so if we're here today and it feels like life has been one storm after another, whatever those storms may be, it's just one thing after another in our life, and we're beginning to wonder if it's worth it, or we're beginning to think, and we're straining at the oars like the disciples, and we're beginning to wonder, does God care? Does God see? Look at this text and remember that Jesus saw his disciples in the storm. And while the disciples are straining at the oars and they may not know when the storm is going to end, and we may not know when the storm is going to end, we can remember that Jesus saw his disciples in the storm. And sometimes those storms that we may face in our life may be designed to help us see or remember that Jesus sees us in our distress. There in verse 53, when they had crossed over and came to shore there at Gennesaret and anchored there, as they got out of the boat, people immediately recognized him. That's Jesus. And they hurried throughout that region and began to carry the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages and towns or the country, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch just the end of his robe. And everyone who touched his robe, touched it, was healed. Now, look there at the text one more time. Going all the way back to verse 45, where were they sent ahead to? Verse 45 says they were sent ahead to Bethsaida. But they came to shore at Gennesaret. They're not where they want to be. But that's okay. Because Jesus is Lord. And we are never out of his sight, but we are also never far from his power either. Even though that Jesus has calmed the storm, even that though he has ended up in a place he didn't intend to end up at, there at Gennesaret, we see the second thing that should comfort us as we face our storms. It's that Jesus cares. If the disciples there in the text hoped to get through this region, sneak through it and no one notice, it didn't happen. Because when they get to shore, there in verse 54, immediately the people recognize him. And we see here, who is Jesus to the people? That Jesus is the one who cares. Jesus is the one who has power. Jesus is the one who can heal them. That even though Jesus is not in Bethsaida, which is where he sent the disciples ahead to him, even though he's in Gennesaret, even though he's trying to make it potentially to Bethsaida there in the text, the people are coming from everywhere to Jesus with the sick and the lame, begging that if they could just touch his robe. You see, the crowd gets it. They understand that Jesus is Lord, or understand that he has the power to heal him, understand that Jesus has the power and cares enough to do something about it. And as the story unfolds there in the text, we see that Jesus heals them over and over and over again because he cares. Anytime, anywhere, Jesus has the power to help. But I think it's also comforting that Jesus cares enough to help. See, one of the big themes that we see there in Mark's gospel is that Jesus has power. And everywhere he goes there in Mark's gospel, he's showing that power and showing his wisdom and showing his love for everyone. And that's all designed to help us understand that Jesus is Lord, and it's revealing different aspects of his character. In fact, there in Mark, Jesus is so powerful there in Mark chapter 5, just one chapter earlier, that one lady reaches out and touches his robe and she's healed. And apparently the story goes throughout the entire region because there in the text, the people are just saying, if I just touch Jesus' robe, I'll be healed too. While the disciples here in the text are struggling to understand Jesus' mission and his ministry and his power and his love and his care, the people seem to get it on some level. They understand that something is different about him, that he has the power to heal them, but he also cares enough to heal him. They had faith in Jesus. They had faith that Jesus cared. They had faith that Jesus had power. They had faith that if they simply went to Jesus, he would help. You know, whatever storms we may face now, whatever storms we may face in the future, I think the key for us making it through those storms is faith. Faith that Jesus is Lord, faith that Jesus cares, faith that Jesus sees us in our distress. So one more time today, I want to ask the question, who is Jesus to you? Is he your Savior? Is he your King? Is he your Master? Is he your Lord? And if so, are you building your entire life around Jesus from the time you wake up to the time you set your head down back on the pillow? Are you living for your Lord? Am I living for the Lord? But maybe you're here today and you haven't made that confession that Jesus is your Lord. But today you're ready to make that confession because you realize Jesus cares. That you realize Jesus sees you in your distress. That even though you are a sinner, even though we all have sinned, we can come to him just as we are. And he will forgive us and take us as his own so we can serve him. If we can help you make that great confession today, please let us know while together we stand and sing.